Starting off this countdown, we have the psychopath's behavior.
When I was the punisher, I was the one who decided punishment over the I was the one who spanked the
This interview features a man named Robert who has been deemed a psychopath. In the interview, he talks about the crimes he has committed and his thought processes as he commits these crimes, or lack thereof. What's horrifying is how candidly he talks about this all, and how he's proud of his crimes. He also shows no shame or guilt.
I would tell myself, well, she's not going to be like that. She is going to be the perfect mate. And I told myself that.
Just then, he was talking about a young girl he took advantage of, and basically coerced her into having a relationship with him. You can tell he got a sense of pleasure while talking about what he did to that individual. It's very sickening.
I was grooming her to fit me. To fit me.
It's so creepy how he is so calm while talking about all of this. Again, he's gaining this sense of pleasure just thinking back to his crimes.
In our number 9 spot today, we have John Battalia. John Battalia is certainly quite a piece of work. On May 2nd, 2001, the mother of his 2 daughters dropped the girls off for their weekly visit with their father. Unfortunately, instead of having dinner like they were supposed to, John ended up killing the girls instead. I'm not going to go into any of the details of that because it is obviously an incredibly horrible situation, but he did do this while on the phone with the girl's mother, and he says that his dislike for her is the reason behind these killings. Whether that is true or not, I just want to make it absolutely clear that there is never a good enough reason to do something like this. After deliberating for just 19 minutes, the jury in his trial found him guilty of the highest charge, which is capital murder. On February 1st, 2018 at 9:40 p.m., John was executed by the state. John has always held up this act of the doting and devoted father, and hearing him talk about the girls is incredibly chilling. He talks about them with a sense of pride and love, like he didn't do one of the most evil things in the entire world.
In marriage, she'd stomach about 8 or 9 months, pregnant when she took that picture.
And when you think about that, like, what do you think about?
I mean, you think about your best little friend. Nicest little kid they ever know.
Also, how he continues to blame his ex-wife for the death of his children is pretty telling of just how messed up his mind really was.
She ruined my daughter's life, and she ruined my daughter.
I mean, do you feel like you were killing them to get back at your
I don't feel like I killed.
You what?
I don't feel like I killed.
Coming in at number 8, we have Susan Atkins.
But that we were instructed to go all the way down every house, hit every house on the street, yes.
And kill all the people in those houses.
People in all those houses.
Susan Atkins was an American murderer and loyal member of the Manson cult. She participated in 8 killings, all under the order of Charles Manson. In the cult, she went by the name Sadie Mae Flutes, or Sexy Sadie. She also played a role in the killing of famous actress Sharon Tate. In this interview, Susan talks about the Tate murder.
And we drove to the house with instructions to kill everyone in the house.
From Charlie?
Yeah.
Now, what made people mad about this interview is they claim that Susan was trying to act like a victim. She was trying to gain sympathy to lessen her sentence.
The people in the house were all brought into the living room and tied up, and I remember that Wojtek Bakowski, I believe is his name. I had tied his hands with a towel and then was instructed to kill him.
Whether she has actual remorse or not, hearing her recount the night of this dark deed is very creepy. In our 7th spot, we have Bernardo Giles.
Wife and daughter, and something hit you and you went,
No.
Today may be the day?
Every day may be the day.
Every day?
every day may be the day.
In this interview, serial killer Bernard Giles recounts his first murder to Piers Morgan. It is so chilling to hear him talk in depth about what he did to Nancy Jerry. He told Morgan that he picked her up and drove her to a wooded area where he did the deed. What's scary is that out of all the people Morgan has interviewed, Bernard is the first one who didn't try to prove his innocence. He openly admits that he's guilty and has killed people. At the beginning of the interview, Morgan says, and I quote, "You are serving 5 life sentences for killing 5 young women. My first question is, did you kill those women?" And he calmly replies with, "Yes, sir, I did." This dude has no remorse and no emotions. He even admits to it. What a creepy dude.
In our number 6 spot today, we have Tommy Lynn Sells. Tommy Lynn Sells was an American serial killer who is responsible for 22 confirmed deaths, but authorities have said that they know there are more. One of the aspects that scares me the most while watching him talk about his crimes is how you can tell that he committed these acts because he wanted to and because he liked it.
It was the best feeling I ever had in my life. And the first time I killed somebody, it was such a rush. And it was just like that shot of dope. Every time I did it, it was that rush again.
There is no doubt that Tommy is an actual psychopath, but on December 31st in 1999, Tommy messed with the wrong girl. After severely injuring Crystal Searles, who he thought was dead, this incredible young girl was able to walk a quarter of a mile with a severed trachea to her neighbor's house, where they of course got her help. Crystal ended up surviving and gave such a good description of Tommy, and in the end was able to identify him to the authorities. Crystal not only survived her own absolute nightmare, but she most definitely saved who knows how many lives with her bravery. In watching Tommy talk about his crimes, there is clearly just a lack of emotion or an emptiness behind his eyes.
If I called you something that you didn't like, you'd think about killing me?
Well, if we was in a fight and, get your head down in the concrete, then, so be it, but
what happens when my head goes down to the concrete?
Well, what do you think happens? It cracks like a coconut.
Tommy ended up being executed on April 3rd, 2014. In our number 5 spot today, we have Alex Enriquez. Alex Enriquez is more commonly known as the Bronx serial killer. Alex is convicted of killing 3 females from 1989 to 1990 and is currently serving 3 consecutive 25 years to life sentences. Alex has been incarcerated since the early 90s, but still to this day maintains that he was innocent. There wasn't an overwhelming amount of physical evidence in this case, but there was a detail that Alex gave to authorities in an interrogation that was true to the crime, but it was a fact that police didn't even know at the time, so how could Alex have possibly known this? A few years ago, Alex sat down with Piers Morgan for an interview where he of course claimed his innocence, while also telling some pretty confusing stories.
The bodies.
You gave them a particular piece of information.
Because they told me.
But they did not know. How could they tell you something they didn't know?
That's what they tell you.
They hadn't cleaned the garment. So they're lying too.
Do you really think they said the truth?
There was also a witness testimony from a man who saw and spoke to Alex at one of his crime scenes on the night that it was committed, and of course Alex had some excuse for why this was untrue.
Says he saw you there.
Do you believe that? Have you seen?
You tell me, were you there?
No, I wasn't there.
I'm not sure about you guys, but this part definitely gives me major OJ if I did it vibes. At the end of the day, maybe he did not commit these crimes, and it would of course be extremely tragic that he has been wrongly convicted, but if he did in fact commit these crimes, it's pretty unsettling that after all these years, he still just can't even admit it.
In our 4th spot, we have Ed Kemper. I featured Ed in part 2 of this series, but I think this other interview he did was worse than the first one. So Ed Kemper, or Big Ed, is an American serial killer who took the lives of 10 individuals. This reign started back in 1964, when he took the lives of his grandparents. And he said he did it just to see what killing felt like. This hour-and-a-half interview was filmed in 1991 when Ed was 42 years old. I think what makes this so disturbing is how smart he is.
Extended period of time, and then in the early 80s they came up with this differentiation called serial killing.
which was living two lives, basically. If one orients to the negative side of that living, he would say this person was living a cover life.
He's very well spoken, and in the interview, he went on to describe his tendencies and why he thinks he became a killer, and how he thinks young people need to be supported so they don't end up like him.
Getting youngsters like that help to where they can find themselves and they can find value in themselves and they can find value in interacting with others, and they go in a different direction than what I did.
It's crazy and creepy. Like, this dude is too smart for his own good. In our third spot, we have Jodi Arias. On June 4th, 2008, Jodi Arias took the life of her boyfriend, Travis Alexander. He was in the shower at the time of his death. It's really brutal what she did to him. After she did the deed, she took photos of him on her camera and then threw it in the washing machine as an attempt to get rid of evidence. But upon investigating, her DNA, among other things, were found at the crime scene and she was arrested. So this interview was conducted after her trial. People were outraged by the number of lies she tells in this interview.
Was it unexpected, you think, this verdict?
It was unexpected. For me, yes, because there was no premeditation on my part. I can see how things look that way, but I didn't expect the premeditation. I could see maybe the felony murder because of how the law is written.
She claims the murder wasn't premeditated, but her actions say otherwise. She had it all planned out. She took his life and then dyed her hair, rented a car, cleaned up the crime scene, and fled. In the interview, she also tries to gain sympathy from the watchers. You can tell she's putting on a face of sorrow. You even see her clock the camera, and then when she realizes she's being recorded, that's when that whole act began. It's really scary and dark.
In our number 2 spot today, we have Ted Bundy. If you know anything about true crime, you most definitely have heard of one of the most famous killers of all time, Ted Bundy. Ted killed upwards of 30 people during his crime spree in the 1970s. Most interviews with Ted are extremely well known, but there is one interview that is very disturbing that is not quite as popular as the others. In this interview, he is talking about taking the life of 18-year-old student Georgianne Hawkins. The chilling part of it is how he talks about things just so matter-of-factly, like it's a casual conversation between friends and not him describing the horrific acts that he committed.
She was quite lucid, talking about things. It's funny, it's not funny, but it's odd the kinds of things people say under those circumstances. She had a Spanish test the next day, and she thought that I had taken her to help tutor me for a Spanish test.
After that clip, this interview unfortunately gets even more disturbing as he begins whispering some more terrifying details. When I first saw this interview, I was listening through headphones, and you guys, the chill you get from having an absolute monster whispering in your ear is truly incomparable.
The Hawkins girl's head was severed and taken up the road about 25 to 50 yards. And buried in a location about 10 yards west of the road on a rocky hillside.
After that horrible whispering part, he continues on with the rest of the details of that day in the same casual conversation tone that we heard before. If it wasn't obvious before, after listening to this specific interview, it is very clear just how disturbing Ted Bundy really was. In our number 1 spot today, we have Michael Turner. In 2008, Michael Turner fatally shot his wife as she was about to end their relationship, and also was planning to turn him into the authorities. In the process of this terrible crime, he also injured 2 of their. As far as I know, the injuries to the were accidental, but this obviously does not take away from the terrible thing that he did, as well as the fact of, like, that is literally one of the many reasons why you shouldn't kill someone. In a jailhouse interview, Michael gives a chilling account of what happened on that day, as well as discussing intention and motive. There is a part where he is discussing how he loves his kids and how they love him.
You say you love your kids?
Man, as you see, I've been up for them since I've been home from prison. Hell yeah, I love my kids. And my kids love me, you hear me? I don't know if they still do. But I know my son told me shit before he left. Before I left the house, he told me shit, Daddy, he still love me. You know what I'm saying?
But then later, when asked about how he could love his kids and then harm their mom, he gives quite an answer.
You say you love your kids, but you killed their mama.
So what?
And you're going to jail.
So what?
So you left them alone.
Do what?
You left them alone.
Left them alone?
Yeah.
They got grandparents, they got other people who love them. You know, all that don't matter. They mama up. You know what I'm saying?
It honestly is this callous disregard for the life that he took, as well as the effect this whole situation will have on his kid's life, that is just absolutely unfathomable to me.
Coming in at number 8, we have John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy was an infamous American serial killer in the 1970s, who was given the name the Killer Clown. Why? Well, he would often dress up as Pogo the Clown for neighborhood events or children's parties, which seemed to be his way of meeting his victims. In one of his interviews, he talks about why he would dress up as a clown.
The clowning was relaxation for me. I enjoyed entertaining kids. Like some people are, they unwind in different ways, either by going out drinking or that. I could put on clown makeup and I was relaxed.
That's an odd way to find relaxation, but he continues on saying he genuinely loved being a clown. The interviewer ends up asking him if he enjoyed it because he could then lure victims to him, and Gacy denies this. That's not why he liked it. He liked it because it brought him back to feelings of being a child.
I've always told people when I got into clown makeup, I regressed into childhood. It was fun being a clown because you could be yourself or just let yourself go and act a fool. You could be slapstick and funny and have a good time. That's why I always enjoyed clowning.
Just knowing the horrors that he has done makes everything he says so scary. The interview gets worse though when the interviewer starts asking questions about Gacy's victims. According to him, he doesn't remember any of the horrific deeds that he has done.
I have a lot of things that I've forgotten that I can't remember. For instance, I can go back to my childhood and stuff and I still remember that, but yet I can go into the 70s and there are a lot of things I can't remember.
He then proceeds to grab a book that is filled with his victims' pictures and information and claims that he has studied the book over and over and can't remember anything.
I don't know if you notice here, we got pictures of every one of the victims here, and believe it or not, for the last 12 years I've studied these photos of the victims, and there is no, we have a shot of all of the victims together here, and when you look over at the photos, I have no recollection of any of them. Never met them. They're just names and faces. And when you look at them, the thing of it is, we took it a step further. We went into their backgrounds. I wanted to know where they were at, what schools they attended, who they hung out with, and what kind of activities they were into. And that's what we dug up on each one of the victims.
Now, what he is saying is sick for a number of reasons. Many people believe that he still remembers his victims, but he's just faking this all. And in the end, he is receiving pleasure by learning more about his victims, and this also helps him recount what he did to them. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Harold Shipman. Harold Shipman was an English doctor and serial killer. It was discovered that he took the lives of a number of patients under his care, his total number of victims being around 250. Imagine that. You go to a hospital thinking that they're gonna save you, but instead end up being the cause of your death. Now, during Harold's police interrogations, he refused to speak and refused to look at any piece of evidence that they had against him. In particular, he would not look at the photos of his victims.
Lily Crossley, if you'd like to look at that, just for the benefit of the tape. Dr. Shipman's eyes are closed and he didn't look at the photograph at all. Can you remember Lily Crossley at all? Okay, no answer.
Now, Shipman was obviously doing this so he wouldn't give anything away. But in fact, his very actions in this interview gave away everything. Investigators noticed that when they presented the victim's image in front of him, he would freeze and stop breathing for 9 seconds. So they immediately knew that there's something up with him.
That's Elizabeth Pierce. The three ladies there, it's the elderly lady dressed in black. For the benefit of the tape, Dr. Shipman's eyes are closed and he did not look at.
He doesn't breathe for 9 seconds after they said her name. So Elizabeth Pierce, that name is a problem for him. Something about that victim is causing his body stress, and that is one of the reasons why police knew he had done these horrific crimes. Moving on at number 4, we have Colin Norris. Colin Norris was a nurse that was found guilty of taking the lives of 4 of his elderly patients. He would do so by injecting them with lethal doses of insulin. During his interrogation, he was adamant that he was not guilty.
You're also injecting a patient with insulin.
No, I wasn't. You're sitting there saying, you suspect, you presume, you blah blah blah.
Both men preyed on people they'd been trusted to look after.
So they brought him in for the murder of Ethel Hall. He was the last person who had been with Ethel before she slipped into a coma and sadly passed away.
Obviously, if somebody was going to kill someone, they wouldn't leave their signature, would they?
What do you mean by that?
To say that they were there. I was doing my job.
You were doing your job?
Yeah.
But at the same time, you were also injecting a patient with insulin.
No, I wasn't.
He then goes on to try and convince them why he is innocent. So they accused him of injecting her with insulin. Well, this is what he had to say in his defense.
It would have, if you say, like, somebody came and injected me with that, I would say to somebody, wait a minute, what are you doing? Even when you're giving patients their, like, morphine for through the night or whatever, when you inject them, they do make a noise because, I mean, have you ever been injected with anything? So somebody would have noticed a noise from the patient. And or if the patient was asleep, they would have certainly woke up with somebody went and injected.
The worst part is when he slipped up and literally told the interrogators that he doesn't like old people, and that's basically why he committed these crimes.
Norris admitted finding elderly patients challenging.
The smells.
The smells?
Mm-hmm. I couldn't get used to the smells. When I was bathing female patients, having to wash them down below, I found it difficult to start with, especially if they were like 80s with my gran.
That just makes me sick. He was there to look after the elderly and did the exact opposite. In our third spot, we have Eileen Wos. Eileen Wos is often considered the first female serial killer. She was found guilty of taking the lives of 7 men. This is the last interview of her before she received the death penalty.
You know, I was just wondering how you're going to be, you know, at 9:30 tomorrow morning. Are you prepared?
I'm prepared. I'm all right with it.
At this point, Eileen was proud of her murders. She didn't want to die, but she had accepted her fate. At one point, she claimed she couldn't stand being on death row any longer since she had already been there for 10 years. At this point, she just wanted to die.
Prepared yourself for tomorrow morning.
I'm all right with it. Yeah, I'm ready to go. Hey, I was tortured at BCI. They had the intercom on in the room, and they kept lying that it wasn't on, and they were using sonic pressure on my head since 1997.
This seemed to be true to Eileen. Being locked away, she started to grow paranoid. She thought that the people making her food were spitting in it, and that she was being attacked by a sonic weapon, aka the intercom. Anyways, let's move on.
What more is there to say about the cops? What more do you want to say about the cops?
A lot of stuff. Did you know that they were surveilling me before I killed? And then I knew it? Then I know that the cops knew who I was. After Richard Mallory died, I left prints everywhere, and they covered it up. And let me kill the rest of those guys to turn me into a serial killer.
If this is true, then this is incredibly messed up. And then when she gets mad, it's actually really scary.
You killed 7 men.
Yes, you did.
And I'm asking you, what got you to kill the 7 men?
And I'm telling you because the cops let me keep killing them, Nick. Don't you get it? Ladder climbs, the re-election, everything else. I got a big finger in all your faces. Thanks a lot. You're inhuman. You're an inhumane bunch of and you're going to get nuked in the end. And pretty soon it's coming.
It got intense. I think her facial expressions and wide eyes make it 10 times scarier. Like if I was that interviewer, I would have peed my pants. In our second spot today, we have Paul Bernardo. Paul Bernardo is a Canadian serial killer who, along with his partner Carla Hula, carried out a number of horrific crimes in Scarborough, Ontario. This is footage from his interview with Toronto police detectives.
Did you kill Elizabeth Bain on June the 19th, 1990?
Well, it's a loaded question. I mean, are we going to go back and go through the time sequence of what happened in my life? I mean, I could just give a yes or no answer, but you know, there's a lot of issues about that.
In a way, he reminds me of Ted Bundy, constantly tiptoeing around the questions, saying what he thinks they want to hear, and trying to outsmart them.
Hey, did you kill this person? I mean, well, you're saying I'm lying here, here, and here. I could say, no, I didn't. But I mean, you already said I'm lying here with the PO. You're saying.
Okay, I'm not saying anything about who's lying. I'm simply.
And I've given you directions to go to find the truth.
Right.
No one's done that.
And I've.
Also, take in how he is smiling throughout this, like it's fun games for him. It makes me sick. He's literally having fun with this all. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Carla Hula. Now, we talked about her counterpart, Paul, so it's only fair that we talk about Carla herself. Basically, what happened is that Carla confessed to her roles in the murders and testified against Paul to get out of a harsher sentence. In this interview, she puts on an innocent act and tries to blame Paul for everything that they did.
He kept on pushing and pushing and pushing, and finally I said, okay.
She tried to make it seem like she was a victim and being controlled by Paul.
If I didn't turn the water tap off completely, he'd hit me. If I didn't say the right thing, he'd hit me. He held knives to my throat. He told me I better watch my back. He said, always watch your back with me.
From our understanding, this was her strategy to pin the blame all on him so she could get away with the murders.
Coming in at number 10, we have Pope Alexander VI, aka the Borgias. If you want power, don't bother trying to be a king. Becoming the Pope is much more lucrative. Hesitate to put him on this list was that if he didn't exist, we wouldn't have the Borgias, which was a great TV show. Anything with Jeremy Irons, I am in. But this guy, along with his whole family, were about as corrupt as they come, to the point where we can't help but be like a little bit impressed. He achieved the papacy through nepotism and bribery, and then continued to make his family the most powerful in the world wherever he could. His children Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia were notorious for their illicit affairs and even murder, with Lucrezia being referred to at one time as the Black Widow of Rome. Though her father often used her as a pawn, he married off to rich merchants, and then when their usefulness expired, he claimed the marriage to be null and void so he could just do the whole thing again. He also allegedly held massive orgies and challenged those in his company to see who could do the most of it. But worst of all is this, something called the Inter Caetera, a papal bill he issued that authorized Spain and Portugal to colonize and enslave the Americas and Africa. So I guess we all know why he's on this list, besides all the rest. Number 9. The Purdue family. Speaking of families, right? Wow. One bad apple spoils the whole bunch, and that is definitely the case with the Purdue family. This family conned their way to becoming the richest family in America, taking the lives of over 200,000 people without even lifting a finger. The Sackler family accumulated their $13 billion net worth when their private company called Purdue Pharma developed a revolutionary new drug called Oxycontin. Their slogan was the drug to start with and stay with, and they assured millions that it was safe to use. Oxycontin contains something called oxycodone, which was a relative to another very deadly drug featured very strongly in the film called Trainspotting. Ever heard of Chasing the Dragon? But it was 2 times as powerful as morphine, and what a breakthrough for pain management. And they couldn't help the $35 billion it made for Purdue Pharma. They continued to market Oxycontin as a safe drug to use, but instead, they caused the opioid crisis in the 1990s. Good job, Big Pharma. Mark Clepine. The École Polytechnique was one of the most horrific acts of hate ever performed in Canada. After a roller coaster ride academically, Mark Clepine was denied entry into Montreal's École Polytechnique engineering program. But no one knew that this would be the straw that broke the camel's back. On December 6, 1989, Mark walked onto the campus with a concealed semi-automatic weapon. Once inside, he separated the men and the women and then opened fire on all the women while shouting, "You're all feminists." He then ran into the hall, shooting any woman within his sight. He then took his own life, and in the note that he left, he blamed feminists for ruining his life and included a list of 19 more feminists he should have killed if he hadn't run out of time. Mark Clepine walked into the school with the intention of killing every single female student in that school just because he was mad that they wanted to be engineers. What is known as the Montreal Massacre shook the nation and became known as one of the deadliest shootings ever to happen in Canada. We wish we could forget the man, but let us always remember the woman who died. Number 7. Robert Pikon. I hate him so much. Here we have another Canadian serial named Robert Pikon. Between 1978 and 2001, 65 women went missing in and around Vancouver's east side, gone without a trace, and a lot of them were women of the night. So there was, shall we say, a flagrant lack of enthusiasm when it came to looking for them. Pikon owned a pig farm, which to the unseeing eye looked to be just that, until police made an all too morbid discovery. What started out as a search for illegal firearms became far darker when they found discarded items like an inhaler, a shoe, a shirt, so on. Pikon confessed to taking the lives of 49 women, though he was only tried for half of that, though many of the bodies weren't found because he fed them to the pigs. Anthropologists even brought in a conveyor belt to sift through the dirt in order to find the evidence they needed. What's even worse about this story is that they could have caught him earlier. One of the women he attacked escaped after they both inflicted stab wounds on each other. They were being treated at the same hospital, and the police found a key in his pocket that fit the handcuffs she had on. But the case was dismissed, however, because she wasn't considered a reliable witness due to her drug addiction. So great police work there. Gold star. Number 6. Jeffrey Epstein. Yes, we are here, and here he is. If you have been lucky enough to have been living under a rock, then move on. There is no reason for you to even know his name, you lucky human. But for all those who've heard it but aren't quite sure what happened, well, you might as well know now. Epstein was a wealthy financier who seemed to have unlimited connections with the world's elite, but for reasons that go beyond the material. Epstein was convicted, to put it lightly, of exploiting and inappropriately taking advantage of female minors. He abused and manipulated young women into recruiting other young women into his circle of exploitation. He would lure them into giving him massages for money, which would turn into... The authorities compiled a 53-page long indictment that gave a hefty reason for Epstein to be given a lengthy prison term, though prison is where he died. Epstein was found unresponsive in his cell several weeks after he entered prison, and it is believed that he took his own life, though some people suspect foul play. Due to his wealthy connections to people like Prince Andrew, there is a much bigger case here, which makes Epstein the perfect example for someone we wish never existed. Ugh, I hate this guy. Ugh. Number 5. Albert Fish. Ugh. The Gray Man. You've probably heard of him before. You know me, you know this channel, and you know we talk about some pretty dark stuff, especially people who like to, I don't know, viciously kill for a living. But out of all of the ones I've covered on this channel, this name still feels like ash in my mouth. The crimes of Albert Fish were so abhorrent, it's almost unfathomable. Also known as the Brooklyn Vampire or the Gray Man, he killed one victim for every state, or so he claimed. A notorious sadist, he exploited, kidnapped, and tormented his young victims, all while hiding his deeds from his wife and his 6 children. Which was pretty easy at first. He looked like a regular shy guy on the street, someone you wouldn't look twice at. But beneath that facade of the ordinary lied an extraordinary killer. He also practiced masochism and would regularly punish himself by lighting his body on fire and puncture himself with nails. If he did that to himself, we can only imagine the extent to which he went when it came to his own victims. Awful. Awful human being. Ew. Get out. Number 4. Madame Lori. Richard Cow. I hope I said your name right. But you recommended this. Richard, as soon as I saw this name, I totally face palmed. I was like, of course! Why did I have a brain fart? Of course she should be on this list. This woman should never have existed. Slavery was already exploitive and cruel. That shouldn't have existed in the first place. And this woman brought it to a whole new level. She's on par with Bathory for me for sure. The best part about American Horror Story Covenant is we got to imagine that she got her comeuppance, because she never actually did. Delphine LaLaurie was a French aristocrat in New Orleans who exploited, tormented, and treated the slaves she owned viciously. Like she enjoyed it too. Others had suspicions of her cruelty, especially when a slave woman ran and jumped to her death because LaLaurie was chasing her. After that, she was forced to sell her slaves, but bought them back secretly through family members. But things really came to a head on April 10th, 1834, when authorities rescued a 70-year-old slave woman who was found chained to a stove. She had set the house on fire in order to escape her mistress, but instead led the men up to the top of the house where they found LaLaurie's medieval torment chamber. 7 slaves were tied in spite with iron collars, and that was barely a scratch on the rest of the things she did. A town mob gathered outside the house, but she never faced any real punishment for her crimes as she fled New Orleans because her reputation was ruined. Whoop-de-doo. Number 3! Jim Jones. About a dozen of you requested Jim Jones, so here he is, and rightly so. The poster child for the phrase, all together now, don't drink the Kool-Aid. Cult leaders are the worst. Hint, if someone says they are the Messiah and that you should follow them blindly, just run. What makes this man so awful and so terrifying is just how effective he was at manipulating people. Jones was the leader of the People's Temple cult in San Francisco and led under the title The Prophet. The cult began in the 1950s, but later in the 1970s they came under scrutiny from the public. So he convinced his 1,000 followers to move to Guyana in order to set up a commune where they could all live peacefully. But that was the last thing on his mind. He confiscated their passports, all of their money, blackmailed and threatened their lives. So I guess now we know how he kept his followers. US Representative Leo Ryan went to the commune to investigate the claims of abuse, but was killed by Jones along with his 4 members. That same day, November 18th, 1978, the culmination of his leadership called the Jonestown Massacre occurred, where he ordered his followers to drink cyanide-laced punch, killing every single one of them. Get rid, Jim Jones, don't like you. Number 2, Kim Il-sung. Oh, let's hope no one in North Korea is keeping an eye on this channel, because today we have to talk about the Korean War, which means we have to talk about Kim Il-sung, which means somebody in North Korea right now is probably very upset about this. Kim Il-sung was directly responsible for the Korean War that separated North Korea and South Korea. After World War II, when Japan surrendered, Korea was split in half, the North occupied by the Soviets and the South by the US. Kim was appointed by the Soviets, aka Stalin, remember the first list, to the Provincial People's Committee. From there, Kim created the Democratic Republic of North Korea, where he developed a cult-like following, built up his military, eliminated his competitors, and by 1950 he announced to Mao Zedong, remember the first video, and Stalin that he was ready to unite Korea under communism. June 25th, 1950 he attacked South Korea, amounting to the deadly loss of over 3 million people. When the war ended in a stalemate, Sung was heartbroken, but he was still determined to rule. He enforced his communist regime where all information came from the state, true or otherwise, and exaggerated and villainized anyone outside his territory. To ensure everyone behaved, whole families who spoke out against him would just disappear. He basically created a real-life 1984. That's what happened. Because of him, North Korea is what it is today, a nuclear bomb waiting to go off. But according to them, it's the other way around. What do you think? Let us know. Coming in at number 1, again, at least a dozen of you were like, this guy. There's at least one evil German World War II leader on this list, and we all know the reason. Again, nearly a dozen of you suggested him across both videos, so here we go. It was one thing for a soldier to come knocking at your door, but the SS struck a whole different kind of fear. Himmler was the reason why. Heinrich Himmler is one of Adolf's most famous henchmen and was the second most powerful man in the Third Reich. In April 1934, Himmler was appointed assistant chief to the Gestapo in Prussia, but made sure to spread his influence across the whole Reich. He was the mastermind behind the Purge, or the Night of the Long Knives, where any competitors of Adolf were eliminated by the SS. This secured the ruler's position, and Himmler went on to create the most powerful armed body in Germany. But above all, he was the one behind the conception and implementation of the so-called final solution, which resulted in the death of 6 million Jews. So, need I say more? Number 10, Tamerlane the Great. How about Tamerlane the not great dude? Oh, it's so bad. Tamerlane was a great conqueror of the Turks who was infamous for building a tower of skulls. This man will make you thankful for democracy, or just like everything we have today, if you weren't already. He ruled around 40 years until he died in 1405 CE. He was a huge fan of Genghis Khan, and he believed he was his descendant. He wasn't directly on his father's side, but he kind of was. And based on what we know of Genghis Khan? Not hard to believe, he had a lot of kids. To pay homage to his great-grandfather, he built an empire that stretched across Russia, the Mediterranean, and India. No mercy was his motto, annihilating whole cities in one fell sweep. He burned down a mosque in Damascus with people still inside just to heighten the fear. One of the most gruesome things he ever did was behead over 90,000 people, enough to build 100 towers of decaying skulls. Right? Unlike his idol Genghis Khan, his brutal campaign wasn't about protecting trade routes and flanks, but more about, bragging rights and power. The Timurid Empire didn't survive for very long because they never put in any governmental structures after they destroyed their territory, so it's kind of like once you just conquer somewhere, you have to take care of it after, but he didn't. In other words, he may have conquered many places, but he never truly ruled after he destroyed them. He killed around 19 million people, probably more, during his conquests and skinned alive any who wouldn't convert to Islam. Whew! Vicious! Vicious! Number 9, Issei Sagawa. Man, I can't believe this dude is just like walking around free. It really freaks me out. I don't want to forget this man exists at all, so if I ever see him, I can run in the opposite direction, and as should you. In 1981, Sagawa took the life of Renee Hartfeld and then he ate her. Yeah. He took 2 days to consume her, and apparently this crime had fulfilled a lifelong desire for Sagawa. He did try to get diagnosed by a psychiatrist who actually declared him highly dangerous, but because he was the son of a rich Japanese businessman, rather than getting help, his father sent him to school in Sorbonne, France. Issei apparently had the desire when he saw his classmates' thighs while at school, and he thought they looked delicious. Ugh. While at school in France, he finally met his target, Renee. The two became friends, well, on her end. She had no idea what was about to happen. Thankfully, she wouldn't have realized what was about to happen as he shot her in the back, which is like a really small mercy. Ugh, I'm glad she wasn't like cognizant. He selected her because of her youth and beauty, and Issei wanted to absorb her energy so he wouldn't be as weak. He packed up what was left of her corpse into a suitcase and took a cab over to a park and dropped them off. But bystanders saw the blood leaking and called the police. He admitted it, was declared insane, as he already was, deported back to Japan where he was supposed to stay in a mental institution, but they declared him sane, and since the case was dropped in France, he only had to stay for 15 months in the institution. And he is now free, walks the streets, and says he still has the same desires. Number 8. The Killer Actor. A black mark on the profession, no doubt. Ramiro Artaida was so set on revenge and coercion that he went to acting school so he could be better at it, right? Between 1937 and 1939, Ramiro was responsible for the gruesome deaths of over 8 women. His thing was that he would create characters in order to lure women to secluded areas. His go-tos were a monk, a film producer, and a professor. The motivation behind his killing spree was related to the accusation made against him years before. Ramiro was engaged to be married, and he came from a wealthy estate. He was accused of killing his older brother in order to ensure that the estate passed solely to him, and it was due to these accusations that his fiancée left him, but nothing was proven. Distraught, he fled Bolivia and studied drama in the US, only to return and exact revenge on any women who looked like his ex. Like, talk about a dramatic breakup. Thankfully, he was caught and sentenced to death in 1939. Yikes. Number 7. The Great Blood Sorceress. What a name, right? Next up, we have Magdalena Solis, who unfortunately earned the bad nickname of the Great Blood Sorceress. Why was this woman so evil? Well, she was a cult leader who manipulated and tormented her followers due to her warped sense of self. A religious fanatic with an already delusional sense of who she was, she joined the Santos Cayetano Hernandez cult in 1963 in Mexico. She traveled with the cult to Yerba Buena, a town with a tiny population of only 50 people, all sadly destitute and poor. She took severe advantage of the people, convincing them that she was the reincarnation of an Aztec goddess. Okay? I don't know if you know anything about the Aztec tradition, but whoa. The brothers who founded the group knew it was fake, but Magdalena even sold herself on the charade. She was responsible for 8 confirmed deaths, though probably more. They died due to the gruesome ritual sacrifices she performed on them. Like, think Temple of Doom, Indiana Jones, like like that. That's exactly what she did. Ugh, this woman would torment and beat them, then take out their hearts and drink their blood. Like, ugh, just horrendous. I hate this. It's just gross. Don't join cults. Anyways, number 6, Delphine Lalaurie. It was only a matter of time before Delphine Lalaurie made it onto this list, and I know you've been waiting. Lalaurie first caught suspicion over her cruelty when a servant girl threw herself off of a balcony whilst being chased by Lalaurie. But the real horrors were revealed when rescuers found a 70-year-old slave woman chained to the stove during a house fire. The woman had set the fire herself and tried to take her own life for fear her punishment would lead her to the attic. When authorities ventured up to the attic themselves, they saw several bodies of servants mutilated and hung by the neck. Needless to say, the whole town was set ablaze after that with anger. A mob surrounded the Lalaurie mansion with the desire of confronting and punishing the cruel woman, but she had disappeared. To this day, no one knows what happened to her. I mean, she's definitely dead. She was socially ruined, but as to where and how, no one knows. But she was never properly punished for her crimes. Number 4, the Monster of Echotek. Truly a monster. There are monsters in this world, as this series of lists have proven. Juan and Patricia Carlos were responsible for taking the lives of over 20 women, causing widespread panic in Mexico City in 2018. Patricia was his helper and would lure women to their home by promising them cheap clothes. Once inside, Juan would take over and severely violate them in perverse ways before taking their lives. The couple would also remove organs and feed them to their dogs. They were not picky with their victims either, making it hard for authorities to develop a pattern. They took any woman they found, even a young mother, and they tried to sell her infant she left behind. But unfortunately though, quite gruesomely, the two were caught when they were found pushing a stroller of body parts. Carlos warned police after his arrest that should he be released, he will do it all again, so they better listen to him. Just keep him there. Coming up to number 3, if you like this list so far, make sure to show some love, like, subscribe, comment, do your thing. It's gonna get weirder from here, so if this is too much for you, please take a moment, go for a walk, do what you need to do, and then come on back. Number 3, Andre Chikatilo. I think the creepiest and most evil people are the ones you least expect, and that's what terrifies me about this guy. I would take a poltergeist any day over someone like Andre. Andre was a teacher in the Soviet Union, trusted by so many, but little did anyone know he took the lives of 50 young people before he was caught. His case actually inspired the book Child 44 by Tom Robb-Smith, which is actually one of my favorites, by the way, couldn't put it down. The reason he was able to get away with the killings for so long was because of the USSR. Crimes like this didn't exist in Stalin's Russia, so these events were often covered up at the scene, so it was easy for criminals like this to get away. Meanwhile, Andre was addicted to taking the lives of these women, as it was the only way he could achieve satisfaction. The reason he was so pathologically messed up started in his early childhood. Stalin's agricultural policies caused widespread famine, and from part 1 we know he's not a good guy himself. But Andre was believed to have suffered from water on the brain at birth, causing him to get frequent UTIs and often wet his bed. He was also bullied due to his father's capture in World War II because it was seen as cowardly. Whatever the cause may be, he still committed some vicious crimes, and thankfully he was arrested in the 1990s. And though we have sympathy for him, man, takes a certain kind of person to do something so horrible. And number 2, Shirou Ishi. We've talked about Mengele in a previous video, but it's time we talked about Ishi. Ishi and Mengele honestly probably would have been best friends, both having a sick fascination with cruelty and medicine. Shirou Ishi was the director of Unit 731 in the Department of Biological Weapons for the Japanese Army in World War II. What was his job? To develop an understanding of the most deadly kinds of science. How? Well, I bet you can guess. He would perform all of his experiments on prisoners of war trying to understand disease, warfare, and sickness. He would perform horrendous experiments such as injecting prisoners with diseases like anthrax and testing out biological weapons on them. His unit even performed live vivisections on prisoners, inflicting them with hypothermia, frostbite, induced strokes, and heart attacks. His cruelty resulted in the deaths of thousands of people. The war was awful, but because of him, soldiers would have rather been shot than sent to a Japanese POW camp. But the worst part is, the US pardoned him in exchange for the results of his experiments. That is absolutely shameful to me. I hate that. Number 1, Norway Terror. July 2011 was a horrific day for the people of Norway after 77 people were killed by right-wing extremist Anders Breivik. At At 3:26 p.m. on July 22nd, a fertilizer bomb went off outside the building of the Prime Minister. 8 people were killed. After that, Anders ventured to Utoya Island wearing a police uniform. Young adults were at a Labour Party youth camp on which Anders opened fire, taking out anyone who tried to escape. Finally, at 6:27, he was taken into custody by the Norwegian police unit. Beyond the 69 young adults whose lives were taken, 319 people were injured, and a later study showed that 1 in 4 people in Norway knew someone who had been there. This was the worst crime ever committed in Norway, and with 1 in 4 Norwegians having known someone, it hit very close to home to many of them. But the worst part about Anders is that though he admitted to the crime, he denied responsibility because the crimes were necessary. Number 10. Tomás de Torquemada. Ever heard of the Spanish Inquisition? Well, this guy was one of its star killers. Not only do we wish it never happened in the first place, it did, so we might as well talk about it and learn from it. But we can't discuss the Inquisition without mentioning Tomás, who was responsible for thousands of deaths. He gave people 2 choices: either join the Catholic Church or die, which led to thousands of Jewish and Islamic people being exiled from Spain. He played the role of inquisitor and was in charge of investigating and punishing heretics. He oversaw the burning of thousands of innocent people, as Tomás often used cruel methods of extracting confessions from people he believed to be heretics. He seemed to almost enjoy his job, hanging, burning, suffocating, and tormenting people with the rack and waterboarding. No one knows exactly how many people died during the Inquisition, but historians estimate anywhere between 30,000 to 300,000. Pretty wide gap there. Number 9. Caligula. Man, his name is too fun to say. Too bad he wasn't a fun guy. It's better I tell you now that essentially this list is a depiction of what happens when the wrong people get their hands on power. From 37 AD to 41 AD, Caligula ruled as if he was some kind of mad god that needed to be satisfied. Not only did his addiction to gambling cause a nightmare for the economy, he seemed to delight in suffering. In the first 3 months of his rule, he made his people sacrifice 160,000 animals in his name. When he first took over as ruler, people actually liked him though. He made helpful political reforms and recalled exiles, but most people blame his future tyranny on a brain fever that befell him later on. He blew money on lavish projects, some still helpful like aqueducts, to building a 2-mile long floating bridge across the Bay of Bali so he could ride his horse across it day after day. He even ordered his men to attack the sea by collecting shells with their helmets. His lascivious love affairs included copulating with the wives of his allies and even allegedly his own sisters. Caligula's reign was equal parts terrifying and embarrassing, which is probably why his officers stabbed him to death. Number 8. Leopold II of Belgium. During the height of colonialism, Leopold of Belgium wanted to make his mark by conquering the African Congo. As soon as I say colonialism, you know where things are going, so get ready. He made it his property, and instead of, being a good human being, he decided to establish a dictatorship instead. He made the rest of Europe think that he was acting as a good guy, so they'd give him money, then proceeded to hire mercenaries. These mercenaries were set with the task of draining as much money from the state by enforcing free labor camps. Anyone who disobeyed or failed to meet demands were severely punished and even had their limbs removed. Leopold was responsible for the deaths of 20% of the population and thankfully was stopped before he could do more damage. Roger Casement, after doing a little digging, released a report which detailed the horrors he had committed under the guise of philanthropy. He was forced to surrender the Congo, though it was considered a part of Belgium until the 1950s. Whew, buckle up folks, it only gets worse from here. Number 6. Talat Pasha. Pasha was the Grand Vizier to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire in the early 20th century and was the main architect of the Armenian genocide. When Armenian families were evicted from their homes in 1915, his signature was on the orders. On April 24th, they executed several hundred intellectuals in order to begin Turkifying the country. Many were sent through the Mesopotamian desert on death marches without food or water after being stripped naked so the sun would just boil them alive. Anyone who stopped walking was shot. He also created a special organization made of killers and ex-convicts who were ordered to carry out the liquidation of the Christian elements. They drowned people in rivers, threw civilians off cliffs, even crucified and burned people alive. Yup. This happened in the 1900s, by the way. So there are about 600,000 to 1.5 million reasons we wish this man never existed, because that is how many people Pasha was responsible for killing. Ooh, man. Number 5. Idi Amin. General Idi Amin staged a coup on January 25th, 1971 and forced Uganda's first Prime Minister Milton Obote into exile. From there, he created a reign of terror that abused Uganda's freedom after more than 70 years of British rule. Amin organized mass executions of Akoli and Lango Christian tribes who were loyal to Obote. He terrorized his own country with internal security forces whose main purpose was to eliminate those who opposed him. His brutality also resulted in the collapse of the economy. This man just seemed like he just didn't have a single good bone in his body. He was also rumored to have eaten human flesh, and his vicious and inhumane rule resulted in the death of 300,000 civilians. Eventually Amin was forced to flee and sought refuge in Saudi Arabia, though he was never punished for his crimes and died in 2003 due to organ failure. So he got away with it, essentially. Number 4. Pol Pot. You'd think a leader's job would be to protect and serve their country with love and respect, but I guess Pol Pot didn't see it that way. Originally named Salasar, Pot was the leader of the Khmer Rouge totalitarian regime during 1975 to 79 in Cambodia, though technically longer. It was a radical communist government who caused the death of more than 2 million people through forced labor, starvation, disease, torment, persecution, and execution. He wanted to purify society and wanted to extinguish capitalism, Western culture, city life, religion, and all foreign influences in order to form a pure communist regime. All media outlets, along with embassies and external medical help, were refused, and essentially he barricaded Cambodia into their own little world. Education was halted, healthcare eliminated. It was crazy. The people were forced into slave labor on the killing fields, only allowed 180 grams of rice a day. Deadly purges were conducted to eliminate remnants of the old society, including monks, police, doctors, lawyers, teachers, ex-soldiers along with their families, and former government officials. His cruelty and madness knew no bounds. It took years for him to finally be put under house arrest by his peers and was never truly punished for his crimes against humanity. He died of a heart attack in 1998 following his arrest. So, yeah. And we're reaching our top 3. I bet you thought number 3 was gonna be number 1. Nope, there were worse people than him, believe it. Number 10, starting off strong with the Boston Strangler. Yeah, you know where this is going. On January 18th, 1967, Albert DeSalvo was convicted and confessed to be the Boston Strangler, though some people believe he wasn't the only one. Due to inconsistencies in the trial, many believe that there was someone else involved. Either way, whoever he was, the Boston Strangler was an awful person. The perpetrator somehow managed to talk his way into women's apartments despite warnings from the media. Women all across Boston were arming themselves, and yet still he found his victims. I don't need to go into detail, but based on his name I think you know how he took their lives. And then some. From June 14th, 1962 to January 4th, 1964 he killed 13 people, abusing the bodies in ways that would haunt your nightmares. So yeah, there's clear why he's on this list. And if that's number 10, get ready. Number 9, Farid Fatah. This is horrendous. This is absolutely horrendous. Imagine being told that you were sick and dying and then finding out later it was all a lie. Farid delivered the news to over 500 people, what's supposed to be what every doctor dreads to say, that they were sick and dying. He sent them through various rounds of chemotherapy, radiation, you name it. The thing is, they weren't sick to begin with. Farid had figured out that he could make millions of dollars off of people participating in these treatments. So while he moved into his $1 million mansion, his healthy patients suffered horrific side effects from the medications such as losing their teeth, hair, their strength, etc. If you ever seen anybody go through cancer treatment, you know it's not amazing at all. His genuinely sick patients died with no care, while his healthy ones got sicker and sicker and eventually just ended up being sick. He would give them hope that they were getting better just to keep them stuffing his pockets. The families also suffered with the impending death of their family members, all for nothing. Finally, the truth came out due to information from a suspicious colleague and authorities caught up to him. Prosecutors sought an 175-year sentence but settled with 45. Good riddance. And also what really pisses me off about this one is that he got away with it for so long and there was no criticism over like 500 people. That's a lot of people. Ugh, bothers me so much. Let's keep going. Number 8. This one's a little controversial. Oliver Cromwell. Yeah, I know. I don't know. I feel like I'm risky, you know what I mean? He wasn't a very nice guy. Sure, he did some good, but he decimated a lot of people, and he abolished theater, which is a big no in my books. After After the Civil War, Cromwell took over as protector of England. For most of his rule, he was pretty much viewed as a dictator. Some believe that he saved democracy, but his means of getting there were brutal and unrelenting. In September 1649, Cromwell's men entered the town of Drogheda and took the lives of everyone they found, which means around 3,500 innocent people died. He acted as God's executioner, his contempt for Catholics feeding the attacks. He was quite brutal to Ireland. Many historians accuse him of ethnic cleansing, especially since a month after Drogheda, he did the same thing to Wexford. Eventually, he was overthrown by Charles II and his republic failed. And there is some missing nuance, I will admit, so if you want to go ahead and correct me in the comments or go into a debate, go for it. Why not? But there was quite a bit of bad and we can't really ignore that. Not a nice guy. Number 7, Marshall Applewhite. Now we have our first cult leader. Woo! Just kidding, not an appropriate response considering how awful he was. Marshall Applewhite was an infamous leader of the Heaven's Gate cult. His first arrest was a little tame. He was arrested when he failed to return a car that he rented. His reason was that he was divinely authorized to own the car. He had some pretty extravagant disillusions and an inflated perspective of self, as cult leaders often do. He manipulated several people to join his cult and participate in a procedure requiring surgical castration. He made everyone wear baggy clothes and was convinced that they were waiting for a UFO to arrive. The Haley Bob comet was the signal, and Applewhite organized a Last Supper of sorts. They all went to a restaurant and ordered the same thing: turkey pot pie, cheesecake, blueberries, and iced tea. Not my choice, honestly. Finally, on March 21st, when the comet was days out, he manipulated 30 people to take their own lives. Number 6, The Serpent. I'm a big fan of Jenna Coleman, who played Clara in Doctor Who, and when she showed up in the new Netflix show The Serpent, I was in. But then I was horrified to learn that it was about a real human that existed, and I really wish they didn't. Charles Sobrage, along with his girlfriend Marie-Andre Leclerc, committed a spree of crimes along what was called the Hippie Trail. During the 1970s, Vietnamese, Indian, Frenchmen lured over a dozen tourists into a false sense of security before taking their lives. He preyed upon travelers in India, Nepal, and Thailand by spiking their drinks, food, stealing their valuables and identities before brutally making them disappear. He became the subject of a massive Interpol manhunt in 1976 after a junior diplomat in Bangkok started to catch on. If his crimes were anywhere as brutal as they were hinted at in the show, I certainly wish he never existed. Thankfully, he continues to serve a life sentence to this day. Number 5, Dennis Rader. I'm surprised that I haven't added him to this list earlier, but I needed to do a part 7, so I guess here we are. The BTK killer, the man not only known for taking the lives of 10 victims, but for how he did it. Between 1974 to 1991, he baffled police with his violent crimes in Wichita, Kansas. BTK was used to describe how he took their lives. I'll have to ask you to look that up because YouTube gets mad at me when I say those words, but I think you can guess that he took his time and he did it viciously. What's even worse is he had everyone fooled into thinking he was a kind, family-loving, God-fearing man. He disappeared after taking his last victim in 1991, but he returned a few years later annoyed that no one had caught him and that the press had died down. In 2004, on the anniversary of one of his crimes, the Otero family, Dennis sent a floppy disk to the police. This helped police track him down to his church, but even then, it wasn't until 2005 that he was finally arrested and sentenced to 10 life sentences. 1 per victim, I guess. I think we know why he's on this list. Number 4, Ed Kemp. Good old Eddie Kemp. Again, weird that I haven't added him to this list sooner. A weird kind of evil because he actually ended up giving authorities a ton of information on psycho killers. But alas, he haunts my dreams and I just really wish we didn't have to worry about men like him. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I will take ghosts, ghouls, poltergeists, whatever over human beings any day. He had a strange talent for making people believe he was a gentle giant, all while committing 10 of the most gruesome crimes. With an IQ of 145, he easily manipulated his victims into trusting him before it was the last thing they ever did. Standing at 6'9" and weighing 250 pounds, he used both brawn and brains to overpower the women he took. He showed obvious signs of pathological need to kill from a young age, starting with the family a cat, all the way to unaliving his paternal grandparents at age 15. You get the gist. Even then, he was able to convince mental health professionals to let him go early. He was charming. He was easy to get along with. He was likable. And he did this. From 1972 to 73, Ed used the line, "Ugh, I don't have all day," to convince hitchhikers to enter his car, implying he was in a rush, put pressure on them, and convinced them that he didn't have time to kill them. They also never caught him. He turned himself in before they could. Number 2, Andrew Philip Cahoe. Things could have gone either way for Andrew. He loved helping people, but also was quick to anger. Considering he's on this list, we know which direction he went. When he was 14, the stove exploded, setting his mother on fire. Andrew watched her burn a little too long before he grabbed some water and put it out, but by that point it was just too late. Andrew showed the telling signs of darkness through his cruelty towards animals, once beating a horse to death. He married a wealthy woman named Ellen Price in 1911, but despite this, the couple fell into debt. Ellen got TB, pushing them further into debt until finally, at long last, Cahoe snapped. On May 18, 1927, Cahoe took Ellen's life by hitting her in the head. He set the barn on fire with explosives. He had previously placed explosives around the Bath school, and after he burnt down the barn, he drove over and detonated the bombs at the school, killing basically everyone who was inside. Then he filled his truck up with more explosives, admitted the crime in front of everybody, and then detonated the truck with a Winchester rifle while he was inside. Number 1, Jean Bedel Bokassa, one of Africa's most brutal dictators, and was even accused of consuming human flesh and even feeding his opponents to animals. He was the self-crowned emperor of the Central African Republic until he was kicked out in 1979. His coronation alone bankrupted his own country, as it basically cost the entire GDP. He took all of the government posts for himself and established what has been referred to as a reign of terror. He personally oversaw brutal beatings and made the rule that thieves should have their ears cut off. He arrested school patrons for not wearing uniforms made in the factory he owned, and even had 100 of them executed. In 1980, he was finally sentenced to death in absentia, though he decided to return to Africa in 1986. Why he was allowed to, no idea. From there, he was tried again for his crimes, but he never faced the death penalty. Instead, he just went to jail, and he was released in 1993. Then he died, and then he was pardoned in 2010. What?
Starting off this countdown, we have the Hitchhiker's Killer. The Hitchhiker's Killer is the name given to serial killer Donald Henry Gaskins. He started his killings in 1969, where he would pick up hitchhikers to later kill them. It's believed that he killed more than a dozen people. But even before he went on this killing spree, Gaskins had a history of sick crimes. Finally, on November 14th of 1975, Gaskins was arrested after a man witnessed him killing 2 men and called the police. He was later sentenced to death, but this sentence turned into life imprisonment without any possibility of parole. However, his killings did not stop while behind bars. While in prison, he became the only man to have ever killed an inmate on death row. In our 9th spot today, we have Glenn Stark Chambers. In January of 1975, Glenn Stark Chambers got into a heated dispute with his girlfriend, Connie Weeks. It ended with him taking her life. As a result, he was sentenced to death by electric chair, later reduced to life imprisonment. However, Glenn escaped prison on July 13th. Glenn, with 2 other inmates, ganged up to attack their detention officer and then escaped through a window. Now, he was captured 3 days later, but only to escape several years later. So he worked with the prison to help build furniture. He came up with a good idea to put himself into one of the boxes and have himself carried out of prison in a transport truck, and it worked. Even after 3 decades, Glenn has never been found. If he was still alive today, he would be in his 70s, so he could still be out there somewhere. In our 6th spot, we have Ian Brady and Myra Hindley. Between 1963 and 1965, Ian Brady and Myra Hindley worked together to torture, take advantage of, and kill a number of young individuals. What they did was incredibly messed up, and it'll make your stomach churn. Now, these 2 were actually given the name the Moors Murderers, because after taking the lives of their victims, they would bury their bodies on the moors outside of Manchester. Both individuals were sentenced to life in prison for their crimes. Ian was actually placed in solitary confinement, whereas Myra died in prison in 2002. We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with Lester Eubanks. In 1965, Lester was convicted of taking the life of Mary Ellen Diener. As a result, he was given the death penalty, which later got changed to a life sentence. Now, over the years in prison, apparently Lester changed his ways and became very well behaved. In fact, on December 7th, 1973, they let him go out to Christmas shop for his family. While out in a mall, he managed to escape his guards and flee. To this day, he still hasn't been caught. He's out there somewhere in hiding. Who knows where he fled to or what he's up to now. Coming in at number 4, we have Robert William Fisher. Now, this guy is one of the FBI's most wanted fugitives. He is on the run after a triple homicide and arson. On April 9th, 2001, Fisher took the lives of his wife and 2 children before blowing up their house. It is still unclear as to why he did this, and he's been on the run ever since, and police have no leads. On April 20th, his car was found in a forest near Payson, Arizona, but Robert was nowhere to be found. On November 3rd, 2021, Fisher was removed from the FBI's most wanted fugitives list. But despite them doing this, he still remains a very wanted fugitive. In our 3rd spot, we have Bradford Bishop. Bradford Bishop Jr. is a former United States Foreign Service officer who is now a wanted fugitive. On March 1st of 1976, Bishop started to spiral after not receiving the promotion he really wanted. He then left his work early, drove to the bank, withdrew money, and then bought a sledgehammer, gas can, shovel, and pitchfork. He then returned home where he killed his wife, mother, and 3 sons. He then drove the bodies several miles away before burying them in a wooded swamp area before setting them on fire. As a result, he was placed on the FBI's list of 10 most wanted fugitives. They have no clue as to where Bishop is now. He could be anywhere, but they do believe that he fled to Europe. Moving on to number 2, we have Arthur Hutchinson. Arthur Hutchinson has lived a life of crime for murder, attempted murder, theft, and burglary. In fact, he spent 5 years in prison for the attempted murder of his half-brother. In September of 1983, he was brought into a police station after being arrested for theft. While there, he asked to go to the bathroom and then proceeded to jump out of the bathroom window and fled. He was on the run for 3.5 weeks. While on the run, he crashed a wedding and murdered the bride's father, mother, and brother. Later that day, he broke into another person's home and stabbed all 3 of the residents to death. He was finally caught November 5th of 1983 and sentenced to life imprisonment. And in our number 1 spot today, we have Ahmed Siraji. From 1986 to 1997, Ahmed took the lives of 42 females. The bodies of his victims were found in a sugarcane field. What he would do was, after killing them, he would bury them waist deep in his field with their heads facing his house. He believed that by doing so, this gave him great power. But he was later caught and arrested alongside his sisters and 3 wives who helped him. One of his wives was actually sentenced to death, but that was later changed to life imprisonment. Ahmed, on the other hand, was sentenced to death by a firing squad in 2008.